All right, so this is just a video just to kind of go over what we went over class today. And it's, so just kind of a new way of doing it. So if you're in period 5, I did it this way, and I think it was a little bit more effective. And with periods 3 and 4, I was getting there, but I probably should have got there a lot faster. So here's the way we're going to do it. Okay, so we still use our fantastic acronym, really good rib sauce. Okay. And with that, again, the first R is realize. So we realize what a sine graph looks like. But rather than actually putting it on a graph, I know that it goes up, down, then up again, right? That's what a normal sine graph looks like, okay? So when I do my sine graph, as we already talked about, right, every critical point is pi over 2, right? So here's 0, this is pi over 2, okay, up here, and this is going to be pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi, right? But it's every 2 pi, okay? But what's important about this is that it starts at 0, 0. The crucial part starts 0, 0, goes up, comes down, and then comes back up. And it's going to repeat that cycle forever and ever if we let it, but we're only graphing one cycle, okay? That's what a sine graph looks like, okay? So what we're going to do with that, we know that's what it looks like. Again, I'll just remind myself, I'll make a smaller picture. There we go. Okay, but I notice that there is a shift. Okay, I notice that it says plus pi over 2. And so when it's with theta or with x, if it says plus, we usually think, oh, that's to the positive, to the right. But we do the opposite, so that means we actually go to the left, pi over 2. Okay, so that's my new starting point. Okay, so when I graph, that's going to be my new starting point. Okay, and it looks like I'll just go by pi over 2. So that's pi over 2 here, or 1 pi over 2, and it's negative. Okay, so when I go this way, so this is 0, this is going to be 1 pi over 2, this is going to be 2 pi over 2, this one's going to be 3. We get it's in the graph just a little bit, just in case. Okay, so hopefully you see the number system I'm doing. Okay, is I'm just going to go by pi over 2. So this is 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2, 5 pi over 2. And I know I could reduce those, like I can reduce 2 over 2 and 4 over 2. But just for ease, do you see that it goes like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Like I'm trying to keep a consistent numbering pattern here. Okay, so as we said, normally we start at 0, 0. Okay, but I have a left to 2 shift. Okay, so it really means I'm starting here. Okay, so that's my first critical point. I need to have 5. So that means I have to do, okay, so I'm starting at negative pi over 2. I have to add pi over 2. Okay, well, negative 1 plus 1 equals 0. Okay, so my next critical point is actually right here. But remember, for a sine graph, it actually goes up to 1, because here's 1, here's negative 1. So it goes up to 1, okay. Then 0, I have to find my next critical point, so we add pi over 2. 0 plus pi over 2 equals pi over 2. Okay, it comes back down. My next critical point, we add pi over 2, and it actually gives me 2 pi over 2. Okay, so that means it goes down. So that point's going to be right here. And then if we add pi over 2 again, 2 plus 1 is 3, so 3 pi over 2 is right here. So my new graph after the shift actually looks like that. Okay, so that was a little easier because it was pi over 2. Okay, let's try pi over 6 together, again, just to kind of get us in the spirit. Again, so I know it's sine, I know it's going to look like this graph right here, so I don't have to redo that again. But I'm going to notice the shift. It's going to be to the left pi over 6. Okay, so that means when I make my graph here, okay, we'll call this negative pi over 6, or negative 1 pi over 6. Okay, so for all the other ones, this will be 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3. And notice how I'm not writing the pi over 6 part, because I think you get the pattern. We don't need to rewrite that all over again, just so we can get our new anchor points here. Okay, so we know we're starting at negative pi over 6, because we went to the left. We did a shift. Okay, now we got to find our new points here. Okay, so we're starting at negative pi over 6. plus pi over 2, right? Because every time we add pi over 2, because that's where our new critical point is. Okay, I got to find a common denominator, which is 6. Okay, so negative pi over 6 plus 3 pi over 6 gives me 2 pi over 6, which I know you could reduce if you really wanted to, but for this case, let's just leave it as it is. Very good. So there's 2 pi over 6. But remember, for a sine graph, it goes up to 1. So it starts at 0, goes up to 1. Okay. So at 2 pi over 6, we could add another pi over 2. Or, again, isn't pi over 2 the same thing as 3 pi over 6? So rather than doing common denominators again, I'm just going to keep the same denominator, 3 pi over 6, because it's the same thing I'm doing right here. Okay, so then I have to just do 2 plus 3, which is 5. 5 pi over 6, which would be right here. Okay. And then plus another 3 pi over 6 will give me 8 pi over 6, which is right here. Okay. But again, I have to go down 1 this time. Okay. And obviously my graph is, I made it a little bit too big. So there's 9, there's 10, there's 11. Okay. But if you add another 3 pi over 6, you're going to get 11 pi over 6, which would be about here. Okay? So I know my graph's going to be a little off at the end, but it goes up, down, then back up. And that's what a sine graph would look like with the shift pi over 6. Now, we did this in class. Hopefully this was a better explanation to kind of help you out here. But now from here, what we do is we have to do vertical shifts. So imagine this. So if we had this first number 1 here. If I had sine of theta plus pi over 2 minus 1. Okay? So I would just do the same exact thing. I'd still do the horizontal shift, do all that stuff. And then literally what I'm going to do is move every point down 1. So this will move down here. This one will move down here. This one will move down to negative 2. And then this one moves down to negative 1. Okay? So all I did was I did all the shifts still, but I just moved each point down 1. Okay? So if I were to make this one plus 2, okay? So if I were to make sine theta plus pi over 6 plus 2, I'd move every point up 2. So this point would go up to 2. Okay? This point would go up to 3. This point comes up to 2. And this point comes up to 1. And then this point will come up to 2. Okay, so it would look like this. So vertical shift doesn't make any big difference as far as, like the horizontal shift, I know you guys are like, oh, that was the worst. But vertical shift is super easy. Okay, so I'll do one with you. Okay, we'll do one more together. Okay, and we'll do number 3 together, and then I'll leave number 4 to you guys to do. A little suspense. Okay. So, for this problem, again, I know it's a sine graph. It's going to start at 0, 0, look like that. Okay. I see that there is a shift left 3 pi over 4. Okay. And I also notice that it's going to go down 2. Okay. But we worry about the left, right first, then we'll worry about the down 2 here in a second. Okay. So, let's go ahead and graph this here. Okay. So 3 pi over 4. So let's call this negative pi over 4. This is negative 2 pi over 4. And here is negative 3 pi over 4. Right? So we'll just go by fourths here. Okay. So my new starting place is at negative 3 pi over 4. Okay. But again, I have to find my new critical values starting at negative 3/4. And of course, we still add pi over 2. That's what we still do. All right, common denominators. So I'm going to have negative 3 pi over 4 plus 2 pi over 4, which will give me negative 1 pi over 4. Okay, which we know where that is right here. Negative 1 pi over 4. Perfect. Except, of course, we know a sine graph goes up. Okay, from the start. Okay, And then instead of adding pi over 2, we know that it's, if we make common denominators, it's 2 pi over 4, which gives me positive pi over 4 if I add that. Okay, so positive pi over 4 would be right here. We'll put a dot here. Okay, if we add 2 pi over 4 to this, we'd get 3 pi over 4. Okay, which there's 1, here's 2, here's 3, but it's going to be down here this time. Okay, and then if we have 3 pi over 4 plus another 2 pi over 4, we have 5 pi over 4. So 4 and 5, so it's back up here. So my normal graph would look like this, okay, with the left shift, okay, but then I notice that there's a down 2. So what I'm going to do is shift all the points down 2. So here's -1, I better go down to -2, -3. Okay, so every point's going to move down 3. So we just go 1, 2, 3, okay. Oh, excuse me, it's only going to go down 2, I'm sorry. 1, 2 down to the -2. This moves down to -1. This moves down to -2. This moves down to -3. And this moves down to -2. So same graph, all I did was just move it down 2. So once you find those critical points, it makes the vertical shift a whole lot easier. Okay, so that's what you would do, and then again, I'll leave you to number 4 to do that one. It's very similar to number 2, except there's the vertical shift involved, so make sure you pay attention to that. All right, I hope this was a little bit more helpful and clarifying, and again, hopefully you do well. We'll talk about it tomorrow.